On July 24, 1996, 7-year-old Morgan Violi was abducted from the Colony Apartments in Bowling Green, Kentucky. 2 days later, law enforcement recovered the stolen maroon van used in the crime. The vehicle held evidence, but in 1996, that evidence did not name the person responsible. 30 years later, one trace preserved from that van would lead investigators toward a man, an attributed confession, and a guilty plea. This story is about what the van kept, what the public record can actually prove, and why the legal ending was not yet complete. The sequence at the apartment complex is brief in the official record, and it does not need to be reconstructed. The man who would later plead guilty first tried to abduct another young girl. She got away. He then abducted Morgan in the stolen maroon Chevrolet van. That is enough to establish the event and the object at its center. There is no need to invent dialogue, motive, or movement the sources do not provide. The important fact for the investigation is that the same vehicle carrying Morgan would soon be found and examined. According to the sworn FBI affidavit, law enforcement recovered the van on July 26th at a truck stop in Williamson County, Tennessee. Investigators processed it for forensic evidence. Finding the vehicle mattered, but it did not answer the central question. A recovered object is not the same thing as an identified offender. In 1996, the van could show investigators where to look and what to preserve. It could not yet tell them whose path had crossed Morgan's. The case had an evidence container, but still no publicly identified person behind it. That distinction is the first turn. The van was not a failed clue because it did not produce a name immediately. Its value depended on whether the evidence inside remained available for later testing. For years, the public result was uncertainty. Underneath it, the physical record remained. Preservation meant the investigation would not have to begin from nothing when another opportunity came. The first laboratory development came in March 1997. The affidavit says the FBI found a fiber associated with Morgan's hair that was consistent with fiber from the van's seat cushion. The wording matters. Consistent with is narrower than unique identification, and this was not the later DNA result. The fiber connected Morgan to the vehicle at a forensic level, described by the affidavit, but it did not identify the person who had driven it. That question still depended on a different kind of trace preserved from the van. The other trace came from vacuum sweepings collected from the van's floorboards. The sworn affidavit says hairs from those sweepings had been preserved on glass microscope slides. It does not describe every step in their custody, and the public record should not be made to say more than it does. What it does establish is the essential physical sequence. Hairs were recovered from the van, placed on slides, and remained available when later testing was requested. Preservation turned an old collection into a new investigative possibility. One of those hairs produced a DNA profile. Investigators searched that profile through CODIS, and the affidavit says the search produced an association with a person. That is the full technical claim supported by the reviewed official record. It does not identify the DNA method, the type of profile, a statistical weight, or a genealogy process. So the film uses the narrower term in the official account, CODIS association. It was a result strong enough to give investigators a direction, but not a substitute for the investigation that followed. That boundary keeps the investigation honest. A database association can point toward a person, but it cannot reconstruct a 30-year-old route or explain what that person was doing in Bowling Green. According to the affidavit and the later Justice Department account, the FBI and Bowling Green police used the association to begin investigating. They had to compare it against custody history, travel, the stolen van, and eventually what the man himself would say. The affidavit also says it is not a complete record of everything investigators knew. Where the public account stops, this film stops too. The person associated through CODIS was Robert Scott Froberg. His name appears here, after the evidence chain, because the name was a lead before it was a legal conclusion. Investigators still had to establish whether Froberg's known movements fit the case and whether he could account for the stolen van's path. The official chronology gave them something concrete to test. It did not begin in Bowling Green. It began with 2 escapes from custody, separated by states and months, and a vehicle taken 1 day before Morgan was abducted. The post-plea Justice Department release traces Froberg's route this way. He escaped from custody in Alabama in April 1996. He was later jailed in Pennsylvania and escaped again on July 16th. On July 23rd, he stole the maroon Chevrolet van in Dayton, Ohio. These facts matter because they place the same man, the same vehicle, and the relevant days into one supported chronology. They are not being used to argue that earlier misconduct proves this crime. Their role is narrower. They show how investigators tested the CODIS lead against time and movement. The release says Froberg was heading toward Huntsville, Alabama, and that Bowling Green lay on his southbound path. On July 24th, one day after the van was stolen, he stopped in Bowling Green. The route does not prove every mile, and it should not be drawn as a GPS track. What it does provide is an ordered set of places that fits the vehicle and the date of Morgan's abduction. The association now had context: a named man, a stolen van, and a documented path through the city where Morgan disappeared. The investigation reached Froberg in Montgomery, Alabama, on February 24, 2026. According to the sworn FBI affidavit, he waived his Miranda rights and spoke with investigators. The affidavit says he admitted the route through Bowling Green, Morgan's abduction, and responsibility for her death in Tennessee. Those details are attributed to the affidavit because this film has not reviewed a complete interview recording or transcript. The point is not to dramatize the confession. It is to mark the second major change in understanding. The route was no longer only a reconstruction around a database lead. It was now accompanied by attributed admissions from Froberg himself. The city of Bowling Green later described that Montgomery interview as a 9-hour session conducted by Detective David Grimsley and an FBI agent. The city says it resulted in what it characterized as a full confession to abducting Morgan and killing her. That duration and characterization belonged to the city, not to an independent review of all 9 hours. The distinction matters for the same reason the CODIS wording matters. Attribution shows where certainty comes from. By this point, the public case had moved from preserved trace to association to route, and finally to an official account of confession. The next step would be legal, not forensic. On July 22, 2026, Robert Scott Froberg pleaded guilty in federal court to 1 count of kidnapping resulting in death. The exact count is important. It is the legal disposition he admitted, and it replaces the uncertainty that surrounded the identity of Morgan's abductor for 30 years. The plea did not make every part of the public record complete, and it did not turn the earlier CODIS association into a different scientific claim. It did something more direct. Froberg accepted criminal responsibility in court, but one formal legal step still remained. As of the final official status check for this script, sentencing remains scheduled for November 2, 2026. The plea agreement called for a life term only if the court accepted its terms. Froberg had not yet been sentenced. The U.S. attorney described the plea as an answer after 30 years of unanswered questions and fear for Morgan's family and Bowling Green. That is an official's description, not private family testimony. The evidence preserved in 1996 ultimately helped establish responsibility. It could not return Morgan or restore the years without an answer. The story ends with her before the fixed outro begins.